a lot of what you're talking about tonight is based on the interpretation of course, a written account of history across many different religions, as you mentioned earlier. If we know that for eons this was an oral history and therefore subject to the kinds of inconsistency in interpretation, how do we look at the Word today and know that it is the truth, taking into account those who would say, in retrospect, if you look at any large body of information, you could add in things that might support your views?
That's a good question. In terms of the oral transmission, I'm convinced that people like Job, for that matter Adam, would have had an oral transmission from God. But in terms of the written record we see in the Bible tells us in the text of the Bible that these individuals, starting from Moses forward, were inspired by God. So they were not borrowing from an oral tradition or oral recitings. They were directly inspired by God himself. And we can put that to the test. You know, and I was telling you about my own personal story. That's what it was all about. We have this message, and we can put it to the test and see how well it predicts future historical events and future scientific discoveries. That's one thing I've found about all the holy books. They all predict the future. But the Bible is the only holy book that predicts it with precision. Now, as far as your comment about, well, maybe people just put this in later after the discoveries were made, in the case of the Bible, we have outstanding documentary evidence that these texts indeed were written very early. For example, there was a debate 30 years ago that all the predictions that are made in the book of Daniel about the historical events of the Greek and Roman Empire were written by a Daniel that lived after the Roman Empire era. But then and that's because the most ancient Hebrew Bible manuscripts we had were dated 9th century AD. But then the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And the Dead Sea Scrolls by carbon-14 dating came in at 200 BC. And so that proved to us that Daniel, because Daniel was included in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that Daniel must have predated 200 BC. Therefore, the predictions he made about the Roman Empire indeed would have been examples of successful predictions in advance of the events taking place. And likewise, we can use the fact that the scroll of Isaiah was also, in fact, the complete scroll of Isaiah was in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So all the statements that Isaiah made about the Big Bang characteristics of the universe, we can prove were written before 200 BC.